Chapter 2. The Birth of Rebellion. Lucifer had once been a being of radiant glory, as a covering cherub who stood nearest the throne of God. His presence reflected a brilliance that had been bestowed, and among the created hosts of heaven his wisdom and beauty were without rival. Every movement of his being testified to the harmony of God's perfect order. Yet within the depths of his heart a shadow began to form. An inward turning, a secret dissatisfaction, an unspoken desire. He began to look upon the Son of God and question what had never before been questioned. Why should Christ alone hold supremacy? Why should the Son of God be exalted above all? At first, these thoughts were fleeting, resisted, half-formed, quickly pressed away. Lucifer had long honored the Son, and he knew that Christ stood in unique majesty, the one through whom all things were made, as it is written in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. The one admitted to the Father's counsels in a manner no created being could share, but pride broke open a door that loyalty had kept shut. Lucifer began to measure himself against that sacred preeminence. He looked upon his own gifts and allowed admiration of self to rise. What had once been a gift, his beauty, his intelligence, his influence, became in his mind a claim. Slowly, love to his creator was displaced by love of his own excellence, and ambition, long restrained, found room to breathe. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. Ezekiel 28, verse 17. The desire grew until it took shape as a purpose. And within himself, he cherished the thought that he would no longer stand beneath authority, but above it. I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High. Isaiah 14, verses 13 and 14. This corruption was gradual, quiet, persistent. The Son of God held rightful preeminence as he had from the beginning. Yet Lucifer, unwilling to accept the place assigned him, began to insinuate doubt where none had existed. He did not at first declare his aim. He worked by suggestions, by half-spoken discontent, by planting impressions rather than stating accusations. Pride does not announce itself at the beginning, it justifies itself. Thus the seed was planted, not in open rebellion at first, but in the inward consent of the heart to self-exaltation. The most exalted of angels, once clothed in the light of divine favor, stood at the threshold of a terrible choice. He could cast aside these thoughts, acknowledge the goodness and wisdom of his Maker, and find joy again in humble service. Or he could nurture resentment, cherish the dream of supremacy, and allow his giftedness to become the instrument of his fall. Because his position was high and his influence wide, Lucifer found an opening to exploit. The angels had lived in perfect peace, not debating the Son's authority as though it were a matter for dispute, but honoring Christ with glad allegiance. Lucifer seized upon what could be twisted, and he began to work upon the heavenly host, sowing doubt, stirring jealousy, and implying that Christ's exalted position was an injustice, an unfair advantage granted to another, while he, though highly honored, was denied equal standing. Before the assembled inhabitants of heaven, a clear line was drawn, and the boundary Lucifer could not cross was made plain. Before the assembled inhabitants of heaven, the king declared that none but Christ, the only begotten of God, could fully enter into his purposes. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 36. That declaration exposed the difference between created excellence and divine sonship, between the highest angel and the one who shared the Father's counsels and carried the Father's authority. Instead of yielding, Lucifer turned that boundary into a grievance. He envied both the honor and the authority bound up with Christ's place. Privilege became entitlement, and rank became resentment. Yet he did not begin with open revolt. He withdrew from the immediate presence of the Father and began to move among the angels with a concealed purpose. He left his place in the immediate presence of the Father and went forth to diffuse the spirit of discontent among the angels. He worked with mysterious secrecy and for a time concealed his real purpose under an appearance of reverence for God. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 37. He approached minds carefully. He did not at first speak in blunt accusations against the Son of God. He raised questions that sounded reasonable, planted impressions that sounded harmless, and awakened curiosity where there had once been only contented trust. Under the appearance of concern for the good of others, he led angels to dwell on thoughts they had never before entertained, until disaffection could be mistaken for honest inquiry and ambition for principled reflection. The essence of his work was misrepresentation. He implied that heaven's order was unnecessarily restrictive, that God's government was too exacting, that the law of heaven limited the highest development of created beings. What had been understood as the foundation of peace and harmony, he reframed as restraint. And while professing devotion, he quietly weakened confidence in the wisdom and goodness of God. He persuaded angels to look inward, to their own judgment, their own preferences, their own supposed rights, rather than upward in humble trust. The spirit that took hold of him was the spirit of a creature reaching for the place of the Creator. You have set your heart as the heart of a God. Ezekiel 28, verse 6. His aim was not reform, but supremacy, not the welfare of others, but the advancement of self. Yet he sought sympathy by presenting himself as one seeking greater good for all, while he labored to draw the affections of the angels away from their rightful allegiance. At first, his influence touched only a few, but the memory of his former honor gave weight to his insinuations. Some hesitated, some listened, some began to ponder. Thus, discord was introduced where there had been perfect unity. The questions he planted hardened into suggestions, and suggestions into convictions. Obedience was portrayed not as joy, but as limitation. God's law was represented not as love, but as restraint. And created judgment was lifted up as though it could stand in appraisal of the government of the Most High. The rebellion advanced by stages, quietly at first, carefully concealed, clothed in the language of fairness and concern, until the foundations of heaven's peace were shaken not by outward force, but by the slow working of pride and deception. Even then, the voice of mercy was not silent. Appeals were made, warnings were given. Patient reasoning pressed upon the conscience of the exalted cherub. Loyal angels regarded him with sorrow and urged him to abandon the path of ambition, reminding him that heaven's blessedness rested on harmony and willing obedience, not on the grasping of supremacy. For a time he hesitated. Conviction pressed upon him, and the light he resisted still pleaded with his reason. But pride held him fast. To yield would require confession that his course was wrong, and renunciation of the very spirit he had cherished. The longer he resisted, the harder repentance became, until hesitation hardened into defiance. He refused to return to allegiance, and the controversy could no longer remain hidden. What had begun as insinuation ripened into resistance, and resistance into open conflict, until the record of heaven's crisis stood revealed. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and he was cast out. Revelation 12, verses 7 through 9.